Good evening, everybody. My name is David Neville, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Edinburgh Jewish Cultural Centre Live. And I'm even more delighted that we've got Tzipporah Johnston with us tonight, who is a textile and mixed media artist based in Edinburgh.
Thank you very much. This is a much bigger crowd than I was expecting, so forgive me if I'm a little bit nervous. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that okay? Cool, right. Thank you so much everyone for coming and for the kind introduction and for inviting me to the EJCC. Just to give a quick rundown of what I'll be talking about, I'll start with a brief explanation of who I am and what kind of work I do, and then I'll talk a bit about the three main projects I'm working on at the moment. And then I think there'll be some time for questions at the end. So, as David said, so the long and short of it is, my name is Tzipporah. I live in Edinburgh. I'm a textile artist, specifically an embroiderer, and I'm pretty much self-taught. Though before COVID, I was going to a weekly adult education class where you brought your own work and just got on with it. So that's helped ironing out some of my bad habits. But I've always more or less, since I was a child, been drawing or painting or knitting or something. And I started teaching myself embroidery about 14 years ago now when I was at college. But after a year or two, I pretty much stopped and took up knitting, which is how a few of you know me. Where Jess had to live with a lot of yarn when we lived together in Israel. And when I knitted, what I really liked doing was making my own patterns and particularly figuring out how to make three-dimensional objects using stitches. This is actually an example of a hat and mitten set that I made that won a trophy at the Highland Show a few years ago. It's a wee bit ridiculous, but it is technically quite tricky. And the brief was a novelty hat and mitten set for a child based on a moorland animal. Oh, sorry, gone too far there. And then this is a doll that I made of Glickle Bassie Hudaleb. And it's quite exciting actually to present to an audience who'll know who she is. And that won the Best in Show one year at the Highland Show. But these are just to kind of give you a sense of the type of thing that I was doing, toys and hats and mittens and gifts, like very domestic things. All my friends' babies were kitted out in handmade booties and dresses and classic home knit stuff, very much in a crafts tradition. And there were a few strands to why I was doing it. Firstly, I've always had this kind of compulsive need to create, and school or work or whatever was just an unfortunate distraction from what I really wanted to be doing. And secondly, I love the tactility of textiles. They just speak to me in a way that watercolor or marker pen doesn't. And thirdly, knitting was a kind of social bridge for me to the rest of the world. I'm autistic and I really struggle with making and keeping social connections. And knitting for people was my way of expressing love and care. And I actually only learned to knit because there was a woman in my Ulpan class that had just made Aliyah, and I was having trouble fitting in, and she knitted and she looked really nice, and I didn't know how to talk to her, so I asked her to teach me to knit. And if she had been doing calligraphy or macrame or clog dancing, that's probably what I would have ended up doing. But knitting also gave me this kind of passport to being allowed to go to knitting groups where you could socialize, but you had a task, so you could kind of move in and out of the conversation, and it was much less intense. So that's how I got into knitting. And how did I get from knitting to embroidery? The answer is that I developed a really bad carpal tunnel syndrome a few years ago. so I'm dyspraxic as well as autistic. They're often linked, and one of the ways that I compensate for my spatial awareness problems and proprioception problems is that I hold really hard onto everything, because if I'm not actively thinking about holding on to something, I'll drop it. So I have this death grip on my knitting needles, and that's actually quite harsh on your joints and tendons and things. So for a wee while, I had to give up pretty much everything, you know, that needed manual dexterity to let my carpal tunnel calm down a bit. And then when I started to get better and I wanted to get back into making things, I needed something that was a little bit gentler on the wrist. And that's when I took up embroidery again, after a gap of about 10 years. And it also coincided with me having a bit of a quarter life crisis and reevaluating what I wanted to do with my life, and also finally meeting people who kind of encouraged me to think of myself as an artist rather than kind of just a crafter, although I have issues with the way that craft is not valued enough. And another artist, she also kind of encouraged me to really value what I was making and to make things for myself, not just for other people. So here's a couple of examples of the kind of thing that I make these days. A note about the photographs. Most of the photographs are really close in, rather than installation shots, because usually when I show my work online, what people ask is, oh, can we see it closer? Can we see it closer? So that's why some of them are a little bit strangely framed, but I hope that it will let you see a close-up of the embroidery. So this one's called Amulet Against Eye Contact, blue, and then it's got a companion Amulet Against Eye Contact, green. And this is about my ambivalent relationship with eye contact, kind of attractive, repulsive, because for me, I kind of fear eye contact. I find it very intense, but it's very much demanded by society. And if you're not making eye contact, people think you're rude and you're avoiding them, when actually, when I'm being forced to make eye contact, it's harder for me to pay attention to what people are saying, because I'm just so bowled over and overwhelmed by the intensity of the eye contact. And there were these little portraits called Lover's Eyes that were really popular in the Regency period, where rather than sending a whole portrait to your lover, you would send just a tiny kind of miniature with just your eye. And so the idea was that only the person who loved you would know who it was, and they would be able to take it out and gaze at it. And whereas what I'm trying to do here is actually make them a little bit like discomforting. When people came into the exhibition, they were in, like a lot of people actually felt a bit creeped out, and that's kind of what I'm going for, because I'm trying to convey that sense of eye contact being really difficult. But it also shows you that I normally specialize in thread painting, which is exactly what it sounds like. You're building up detailed images using stitches rather than brush strokes, and also a technique called stump work embroidery, which is a type of raised embroidery. It has its origins in medieval ecclesiastical embroidery, but it's actually most associated with kind of the late 17th century, and that's when it reached kind of the height of its skill as well, and its most raised and disconnected form. The term just means a raised embroidery, so it can be as simple as padding on the fabric that you're going to work on, and then embroidering over the padding, just raising it a little bit off the surface and giving it a dimensional quality. And then there are more complicated examples where the pieces are worked separately, and then you cut them out and you attach it to another piece to give that more complicated 3D effect. Oh, sorry, I forgot to, this is another example of stump work. This is another amulet example from the museum, which I will talk about a little bit later on. But the, oh, I seem to be missing a slide. Oh, that's really annoying. Sorry. These are pieces of stump work embroidery though, but from a slightly more three-dimensional perspective than the eyes that you saw at the beginning. So this one's an elephant hawk moth. It was made as part of an installation that I did at Porty Art Walk a few years ago, which I'll talk a little bit more about, but it's kind of supposed to be almost like faux taxidermy. And then this is another companion piece, which was the black arches moth, which is about 4 times the actual size. And again, it's pinned in a specimen box, although the way that it's presented in this photograph, you can't really see it. Okay, here we go, sorry. I'm not very good at technology, clearly. But this is a stump work casket from the late 17th century. And it's definitely one of the most glorious examples of the type. They're not all this spectacular with the trees and the little people on top, but it was a very popular thing for young teenage girls to do in that period. This, even though it's clearly like one of the best of the genre, but it's still made by an amateur. This one's in the Royal Collection. And so the type of embroidery I do generally comes out of that tradition, and also from my interests in history and popular belief and the natural world. And I essentially am using these stonework techniques to create little textile sculptures, and combine that with found objects and installation work. Which brings me finally to the Museum of Monotropism, which is the installation that I did a couple of years ago now. It was presented at Porty Art Walk 2019, but it's going to kind of be an ongoing project, probably for the rest of my life. It's about the way that I experience the world as an autistic person. Basically a museum of my brain. So a bit of background about monotropism, the name. It's a fancy way of saying that the autistic brain tends to hyperfocus on a restricted range of interests or activities, and we can struggle to shift our focus outside these what are called attention tunnels. So that manifests itself in having either very intense special interests, which for me have been things like natural history and popular belief and amulets and that kind of thing, but also difficulty with either initiating new tasks or switching between tasks. And because of the way that autism is diagnosed, which is very heavy on the deficits and the things that we find difficult, the ways that we're not normal. Monotropism is it's quite often pathologized as being like a bad thing. We can't think about anything else. We're just so restricted, and I think that that's a shame. It doesn't have to be thought of like that, because just because you don't have lots of small, shallow interests doesn't mean that you're not getting something out of the deep interests that you have. Like we often experience our monotropism as a source of pleasure and flow. And for me, monotropism is the lens through which I make sense of the world. I find life quite often is huge and overwhelming, and people are cruel and confusing, and focusing on a microcosm within a macrocosm makes the world feel smaller, safer, more manageable, and more beautiful as well. And I wanted in this installation to show a version of autism that wasn't about deficit or distress. because that's kind of, you're kind of bombarded with that message that like it's a tragedy and, you know, you're such a terrible burden on your family and you'll never live a fulfilling life. And actually there's loads of beauty in the world and in the way that we experience the world. And I kind of wanted to share that and say, no, look, you know, this could be beautiful. You're just not looking at it right. So this is a couple of photographs of the stage. You saw the hands on an earlier slide. This is just a picture of them in situ. It was a single room in a Victorian house with a mixture of my embroidery and my anthropological and natural history collections laid out as a museum. And actually it's specifically channeling a museum called the Pit Rivers in Oxford, which I was just enchanted by when I lived there. It's as much a museum of the Victorian brain as it is of anthropology. And some cases have just hundreds of the same objects laid out in rows, like hundreds of keys or hundreds of chimarutas or something. And then other drawers have what to us seem just completely random objects stuffed in together that don't seem to belong to each other. So there's a case with a preserved toad from 20th century North Africa alongside a Catholic shrine from the 19th century in Italy, and next to an early modern English witch in a bottle. And I just loved it because it felt like the inside of my brain. Because that's also how I process the world. I kind of hoard information and turn it over and over, and I make links and groupings that seem obvious to me, but they don't necessarily make sense to other people. So that kind of sense of reordering things according to the shape of my brain is what I was trying to convey in the installation. It's, you know, the artifacts from my two big special interests, and I'm a terrible, hopeless collector. So all my collections are kind of laid out. This is one of the herbarium tables that I made. And so here, they're not arranged in a kind of Linnaean classification to do with plant relatedness. They're arranged by like what they were used for, medicinally or magically. And then this is an amulet table that I made. And again, objects are not, they're not grouped by period or by geography. They're grouped by what they were used for, what people believed in them. So you'll have Jewish, Muslim and Christian and animist things all in next to each other, but they're all about pregnancy and childbirth, for instance. And then this is the gallery attendant. Unfortunately, he wasn't very good. He kept lying down on the job. His name is Sandy, but this is how a lot of the collections were displayed, were in these tables. So the next piece that I'm working on came out of this project, out of the natural history strand, but it's also evolved kind of into its own thing. So it's, what I'm working on is a beerometer about the decline of bee populations in the UK. I really enjoy making bees and the challenge of making them as realistic as possible, and they seem to have caught people's imagination. So I think I'll probably end up doing more of them. But one of the side effects of being autistic is that I just move at a pace like geological time. Everything I do is just incredibly slow, and it takes me so long to finish anything. So although hopefully at some point there'll be small individual bees available, at the moment they're all just going into this beerometer. So bees, why am I doing bees? What's amazing about bees? So much is amazing about bees. There's 270 different species of bees in the UK, of which 24 are bumblebees. So they belong to the genus Bombus. And so all of these ones here that I'm doing they're all bumblebees. And I just love them. They're beautiful, they're task-oriented, they're charismatic, they're really important in the ecosystem. There are plants that can't actually be pollinated in any other way than by buzz pollination. For instance, tomatoes, which is why people have started commercially growing bumblebees specifically for this buzz pollination. And they are in really steep decline in the UK. We are a very nature depleted country anyway, but bees have really taken a hammering. And not just in raw numbers of bees, but also in terms of species diversity. So overall species diversity used to be, you would have areas where there would be maybe 8 species of bumblebee, and increasingly what's happened is that as habitats are destroyed, you maybe have 2 species of bumblebee still hanging on in that area. And more generalist species like the buff-tailed bumblebee, which is probably like one of the ones you might know from your garden, they're doing okay at the moment because they can thrive in gardens, and gardens are kind of fast becoming the only habitat available. But more specialist species like the shrill carder or the moss carder or the great yellow, they are really in trouble because their specialized habitats are just being destroyed. There are 2 species in the UK have become extinct since 1940. So the short-haired bumblebee and Cullum's bumblebee. The slide you can see there, Cullum's bumblebee there is in the top right. Sorry, I have trouble with right and left. And then underneath is the short-haired bumblebee. And then 17 species in the UK are what's known as locally extinct. So that means that they've become extinct in geographical ranges where they used to be abundant. And now they're sort of clinging on in little pockets. So a good example of that is the great yellow bumblebee, which used to be across the whole UK. And now there's like a dwindling population up in the Highlands and Islands. And also we're reaching a tipping point where a lot of species won't be able to come back because the habitat that is left is so small and fragmented that the different populations can't interbreed. And so like the genetic profile of the populations is becoming degraded, and it will make it harder long term for them to survive, even if we preserve the little habitats that we have left. And so why are they in such bad shape? Well, one I keep going on about is habitat loss, but really we've lost 97% of our flower-rich meadows in the UK just since the 1930s. And farming has gone over to monocrops, and that's just been a disaster for bumblebees. And again, especially for the specialized species. It's what did for the short-haired bumblebee, and it's what's doing for the regionally extinct ones as well. Secondly, environmental chemicals, especially neonicotinoids, they've been shown to have a really bad effect on invertebrates of all kinds, but also on bees. Thirdly, I talked a little bit earlier about how bees are now being farmed. Bumblebees are being farmed and released, and that's leading to pathogens like deformed wing virus and Nosema bombi, which are spreading out of the farmed bee populations into the wild bees. And fourthly, now climate change is a real danger because bumblebees actually have a very narrow temperature band in which they can thrive, which is why Southern Europe actually has very few species. And why am I giving you this little wee impromptu lecture on bees? Because that's what my bee sculptures are about. They're an attempt to get people to notice bees, to care about bees, to think about them before it's too late. I want people to look at them and share my sense of wonder at bees. And I also want people to look at them and think, wow, yeah, no, we are really close to disaster and we have to do something about it. So this is the Beerometer Part 1. It's going to be a triptych with 3 hoops set 100 years apart. This is the first one, 1920. And this one's more or less complete. The plant life is diverse. There's lots of different types of flowers. On a technical note, this is done with crewel wool in the background, the mosses and the plants. And then the bees are stump work embroidery done with stranded cotton and wire and organza. There's 8 species represented, which 100 years ago were all still very common. The buff-tail, common carder, moss carder, red-tailed, cullums, short-haired, early and great yellow bumblebees. And then this is the second part in progress. So this is 2020. By this time, the cullums and short-haired bumblebees are completely extinct, and moss carder and great yellow are regionally extinct. The third and final part will be 2120, and it's not looking great for the remaining species. And these are 2 of the larger sized bees that will go as in the second part of the triptych. So on the left there is a buff-tailed queen, and on the right it's an early queen. So I started the bees back in January 2020, which unfortunately is no bad indication of my general pace of work. But part of the delay is that I took a few months out to concentrate on making masks for carers and people in the community. And then I've also been working on 2 other projects that have taken up quite a lot of my time. I think quite a few folk will have originally come across me in the context of the fruit of her hands, maybe from Limud. That's my project to make a Torah mantle in honour of the women who sewed masks and scrubs for carers and NHS staff during the first COVID wave. And I did speak at length about it at Limud, so I apologise to anyone who's already heard me there. I'll try and keep it brief. The idea of it is that I wanted to find a way to make a tribute in textiles for the volunteers who gave up their time and skill to plug a gap in the supply chain when the country needed them. So I wanted to find a way to celebrate them and for it to incorporate some of the work that they were doing or the fabric that they used. And I also wanted it to fit in with Jewish traditions about how we honor people who perform mitzvot for the community. Sorry, mitzvot is like commandments or good deeds. And historically, when communities wanted to pay tribute to a man, they did so by offering Torah honors. So you'd be called up to read from the Torah on Shabbat or Chag. If you're really a big cheese in the community, you might get named Chatan Torah or Chatan Bereshit, which is an even bigger honor at Simchat Torah. And until very recently, and in some places still, women couldn't be called up to the Torah. It was just for men. But they could be honored by the use of their handiwork in the synagogue. And sewing and embroidering and donating synagogue textiles has been an important form of Jewish women's piety for centuries. And the inscriptions on them are actually one of the few places where we get to see women writing for themselves. So me'ilim, which are Torah mantles, that's a kind of coat that goes around the Torah scroll. Binders, which binds the Torah scroll closed so that you don't break the cloth. Parochets, which are the curtain that hangs in front of the ark. And bima covers, which go over the reading desk. They were all donated either in thanksgiving for safe delivery or a child or recovery from an illness, in fulfillment of vows, or in honor of a loved one. And the tradition was particularly strong in Italy, where there is even a Mishaberach recited on Shabbat for the women involved in sewing for the community. And so this is a little gallery of the different masks and scrub fabrics and so on that people sent in. And then this is a copy of the Mishaberach translated into English. And the other thing that I liked about this is that there is a tradition of carefully deconstructing and reusing precious fabrics in order to make these synagogue textiles. So there's a lot of items out there that are made from wedding dresses or Shabbat clothes, sometimes donated in life, but also sometimes left in wills with very specific instructions about what they would be transformed into. And so I have a couple of interesting examples here. The one on the left there is a parochet, so it's an arc curtain made from a panel cut out of a woman's dress, a wedding dress actually. And you can see that like it's completely off center. I presume that the way that the dress was cut, this was the only part of the dress that could get a big enough piece of fabric. But it was really important to this woman that this really personal item of clothing would be transformed and used, you know, to the glory of God in the synagogue. And then less obviously on the right, we have two mantles that were made using women's dresses. So you wouldn't necessarily look at these and think, oh, that's made from a deconstructed dress, but that, we have records that these are actually, that's what happened here. And you can just about see a picture in the background of that one of a contemporary woman's dress. And you can see that even the style and the shape and the construction echoed women's fashion of the time. So there is a precedent for using secondhand fabrics in the construction of a Torah mantle. And then there's also a halakhic principle that tashmishe mitzvah, which are objects that are used in the commission of a mitzvah in a religious ritual or something, absorb some of the holiness of the mitzvah. So even an object that doesn't have any intrinsic holiness, like a cup, becomes holy once it's been used in a mitzvah. So if you are making kiddush, the kiddush cup has imbibed some of that holiness, and you shouldn't just throw it away when it's not needed. It needs to be either disposed of respectfully, or you can use it in another mitzvah. So a good example of that is the etrog. At Sukkot, a lot of people, when Sukkot is over and you don't need your etrog anymore, they put cloves in it and make it into besamim, like a spice box essentially for the Sabbath. So with that principle in mind, I recruited 18 Jewish women who had been involved in sewing scrubs and masks, and I asked them to send me the leftover fabric. On the basis that this had been fabric that was set aside for acts of charity and loving kindness, and so that even the leftovers, you know, from the cutting out, had a kind of kedusha to them. I've created 3 designs and samples, and now I'm just waiting to finalize a shul that will adopt the finished mantle, because each one has to be custom made for a specific Torah. After the talk I gave at Limud, I did get an inquiry from a shul down south. They were interested, but I haven't heard from them. They've gone a little bit quiet. I haven't heard from them in a little while. So I'm not sure quite what's happening on that front, but we'll see, and I will keep people posted once I get a confirmation. But when I was designing the possible mantle, I had a few things in mind. One is that the designs need to be beautiful. This is actually a halakhic principle that because people should have awe of the Torah, that they should also have awe of the wrappings of the Torah. They need to incorporate the donated fabric in some way. And I also wanted a congregation to actually be able to use it. So the design needs to be located within a recognizable iconographic language, and be practical rather than kind of too avant-garde, because you know, if you're going to be using this every week in shul, it can't kind of be too unwieldy. But I still wanted them to feel contemporary and fresh. So the first design is based on the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life. Partly it's, you know, the imagery of the Torah itself, and also partly it's about the idea of life and growth and renewal. And it uses donated scrub fabrics for the leaves, edged with embroidery. And then the next one is the Hoshen. So the the Hoshan is the priestly breastplate. And the idea behind that is that the Hoshan represents the unity of the Jewish people because it has all 12 tribes represented on it. But also the Hoshan was used as a kind of mediator between God and the people. It allowed communication in times of crisis. So it felt like an appropriate symbol for a COVID mantle. I think visually it's quite striking if you think about a mantle is going to be held up in front of the congregation and people are going to be sitting quite far away. It needs to be comprehensible from a distance. But increasingly I'm kind of leaning away from this one because I feel like it's more about the crisis and the calling out than about resilience. And what I would like in the project is to kind of foreground that sense of resilience and coming together. And then the last one is based on the idea of the fabric being studded with precious jewels made of the donated fabric and then edged with goldwork embroidery. And it's meant to convey the idea of the preciousness of the mitzvah fabric. And it also recalls the Eshet Chayil, the woman of valor, whose price is above rubies, and she stretches her hand out to the needy. And of course, that's as well where the title of the project comes from, the fruit of her hands. So I'm still hopeful of finding a host community for the mantle, and I'll keep you updated as I know more. And then what next? The next time I'm going to be exhibiting will be this autumn as part of a group show. I'm a member of an artists collective called Nook Collective, which I set up last year with a wee grant from Creative Scotland. There's 5 of us and we're all neurodivergent, which it means we all have neurological or developmental conditions that diverge from the norm. So for instance, autism, but also ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, that kind of thing. And we got a wee bit of money to write a manifesto about neurodiversity in the arts and how things could be improved. And to stage an exhibition to showcase our work and then by extension the work of neurodivergent artists generally. COVID's made everything a little bit more complicated, but so far we're kind of still on track hopefully for exhibition in November. And we've also been doing some research, so we've put out a report on the barriers that neurodivergent artists face in Scotland to working in the arts and what potential solutions might be. And then hopefully by November, when we have the exhibition, the barometer will be finished and ready to show. And I realise I've kind of rattled through that a little bit quickly, maybe, so I apologise. And thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Tzipporah. That was a fascinating talk, not just about embroidery, but also about autism, and giving us a real insight into aspects of autism that perhaps not many people knew about. I certainly didn't. And as you said in your talk, seeing the world from your angle has created so much beautiful art that is not only beautiful to look at, but helps us reflect on what's actually happening to our world, the bees, our ecosystem, etc. So thank you very much. If you've enjoyed this evening, please tell your friends. Yeah. Oh,
and
yes.
huge round of applause for Tzipporah. It was a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Tzipporah.